Let's talk about inflation, shall we? What if I told you that the way that it is measured is not perfect and that there's more than one way of measuring said inflation? I would also like to cast some light on how inflation actually affects the average person and ultimately what you can do to stay afloat and keep inflation at bay. Welcome to The Eighth Wonder, a channel dedicated to making compound interest your best interest. To start us off, let's look at Investopedia's definition of inflation. Inflation is defined as a sustained increase in the general level of prices for goods and services. It is measured as an annual percentage increase as reported in the Consumer Price Index, which is generally prepared on a monthly basis by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. As inflation rises, purchasing power decreases. But that's not all. Fixed asset prices are affected, companies adjust their pricing of goods and services, financial markets react, and there is an impact on the composition of investment portfolios. To some degree or another, inflation is a fact of life. Consumers, businesses, and investors are impacted by upward trends in prices regardless of how deep or when they appear. In simple terms, inflation is that thing that causes the same amount of money to afford less and less of goods and services over time. It is the reason why your favorite meal from your favorite food joint costs more today than it did a few months ago. As mentioned, inflation, like Thanos, is inevitable, and there actually needs to be a certain amount of inflation in order for the economy to run smoothly. For a lot of the countries, including the US, there's a policy for this, and the commonly agreed upon target for inflation is 2%, which some might argue against, but in any case, that is the target. And it is a big reason why we've seen many interest rate hikes since COVID in an attempt to lower inflation and get it closer to that 2% goal. Let's now talk about the Consumer Price Index, otherwise known as CPI. Basically, it is a widely used economic indicator that measures changes in the average price of a basket of goods and services purchased by households over time and is an essential tool for understanding inflation. To calculate CPI, a representative basket of goods and services is selected. This basket typically includes items that the average consumer purchases regularly, such as food, housing, clothing, transportation, healthcare, and entertainment. The composition of this basket reflects the spending habits of a typical urban household. Government statistical agencies like the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States collect price data for the items in the basket on a regular basis. They visit stores, track online prices, and use various methods to collect price information. Once this is done, a specific year is chosen as the base year for CPI calculations. The prices of the items in the basket for this base year are assigned a value of 100. CPI is then calculated by comparing the current prices of the items in the basket to their prices in the base year using this formula, which is simply the cost of the basket in the base year over the cost of the basket in the current year multiplied by 100. This expresses CPI as a percentage of the cost of the basket in the base year. The CPI value indicates how much on average prices have changed over time. If CPI increases, it suggests inflation as it means that on average prices have risen. Conversely, a decrease in CPI indicates deflation, which means prices have fallen on average. CPI is crucial for various purposes, including 1. Monetary policy. Central banks, like the US Federal Reserve, use CPI to gauge the level of inflation in the economy and make decisions about interest rates. So next time you hear Jerome Powell speak, just know that some of what he has to say has to do with this. High inflation may lead to higher interest rates, as has been the case since November of 2021, where to date we've seen about 14 hikes, which is quite a lot. 2. Cost of living adjustments. Many contracts, including employment contracts and social security payments, are indexed to CPI. This ensures that income and benefits keep pace with rising prices. This can be seen with the yearly pay adjustments which we've grown accustomed to. Not that they make much of a difference realistically, we all know that those increases barely keep up with inflation. And 3. Economic analysis. Economists and policymakers use CPI data to analyze economic trends assess the impact of policy changes, and make informed decisions like the 2% inflation target that I explained earlier. Again, without getting too political or anything, these policies aren't always in the best interest of the general public, so I wouldn't put much hope in them. It does help to know the monster you're dealing with though, so in case you didn't know, now you know. Now, with all this being said, CPI is still not a perfect metric and has its limitations. In fact, one significant criticism is that it may not fully represent the spending patterns of all households and that individual experiences of inflation can vary widely. In an effort to address this, there are other versions of CPI, such as core CPI, which excludes the volatile prices of food and energy, and the chain CPI, which accounts for changes in consumer behavior. These variations are used to address some of the limitations of CPI, but in doing so, omit some very important information too. Let's take core CPI for example. It does not take into account food and energy prices, but these are some of the biggest difference makers in an individual budget. When you buy your favorite drink or meal and it costs a bit more than the last time, or the price of fuel increases, thus costing you more to fill up your tank, you instantly feel those. You don't need an official report from any agency to make you aware of this. When you put together a monthly budget, there's no nominal or core budget. It's just one budget and you have to make it work somehow. So when you hear all the reports about inflation being lower, the first question you should be asking is this nominal or core CPI? And are the numbers being skewed in a certain way to drive a certain narrative? In most cases, you will find that core CPI is the metric being used, which is the case with the US Federal Reserve in most cases. Here's why I personally don't agree with core inflation as a very good metric. If you look at the price of Brent crude oil since June, it has been on the rise due to factors like Saudi Arabia voluntarily cutting 1 million barrels of oil per day for the rest of the year in production and lower shipment of oil from Russia too. If there's anything that drives prices higher, it's scarcity. Simple demand and supply will tell you that if an item has high demand and is in low supply, the price will go up, meaning that the prices of oil and gas and all their derivatives will go up too. This will in turn affect the price of transporting goods. So excluding food and energy in a measure of how much prices of goods and services have changed doesn't quite give you a clear picture of what is actually going on. Oh, and by the way, when oil prices increase, it means that the price of fuel will increase, and since you need fuel to transport food, the prices of food will increase too. So why exactly do we even have core inflation in the first place? I mean, it's like in physics when you are told to ignore the effects of friction. In the real world, friction exists, and you can't just ignore it. So what about chain CPI? Well, this one is a bit more reasonable if you ask me, simply because unlike CPI, which assumes that consumers continue to purchase the same basket of goods and services regardless of price changes, it takes into account that when the price of one item in the basket increases significantly, consumers often switch to cheaper alternatives. Chain CPI is often considered a more accurate measure of inflation than the traditional CPI because it better reflects consumer behavior in response to changing prices. However, it can also result in slightly lower inflation estimates compared to the traditional CPI because it accounts for the fact that consumers tend to seek out lower cost alternatives when prices rise. Chain CPI is used by the US government for various purposes, including adjusting federal benefit programs such as Social Security and indexing certain tax parameters. It has been the subject of policy debates as changes in the way inflation is measured can have significant implications for government spending and taxation, so it is by no means a perfect metric either. This might sound a little crazy, but since there's no one-size-fits-all solution, you could always calculate your own CPI to get a true measure of how inflation is affecting you. Just a suggestion. Thought I'd just throw it out there. So for the average person, this will typically be the case. As inflation increases, you begin to notice that you typically pay more for the same things each month. You'll maybe look for ways to stretch your budget, maybe even cut back on certain discretionary items so you can get by. As time goes by, this approach doesn't seem to work so well, and you eventually look to finance more things in your life. You start to use credit, which for a while provides you with the much needed relief you've been looking for, But as is always the case with debt, it has to be paid back, and you start to feel the pinch because now interest rates are starting to rise due to government trying to control inflation. This describes a lot of people's situation right now, and if this is you, you might find yourself stuck between a rock and a hard place financially. Luckily for you, there is a way out of all of this. It's not going to be a quick fix, but it will definitely help you move in the right direction. You need to get to a point where you make more than what you spend. This can be done by either cutting back spending, increasing your earning potential, or both. The latter option being the fastest and the best of the three. You would then look to reduce your debt and pay them off as soon as possible. This you would do using the debt reduction methods found in this video I made a while ago. The link to it will be in the description. The truth is, most of the metrics used to measure inflation, unemployment, or anything in between are always going to lack in one way or another. But there's one thing that always holds true. You can't go broke if you make more than what you spend. That is the best thing you can do to curb inflation on a personal level. If you're looking to learn more about the exciting world of personal finance and investing, then check out the playlist that is linked in the description. It'll help you learn some interesting principles on investing too, which is one of the ways that you can beat inflation and take advantage of rising interest rates. If you look at some of the biggest companies in the world, they've actually been benefiting from high inflation and in some cases, interest rate hikes too. So much so that most of them raise prices in order to increase their profit margins. If you're invested in them, you are able to get a piece of the action and are able to get ahead. All this and more you can learn about in the playlist. Has this video changed the way you think about inflation? Have you gained a new perspective on how inflation works and how you can work around it? I'd love to hear about all of it, so do leave a comment below. The concept of inflation is one that will always be part of our lives, therefore we'll always have to find ways around it. To learn more about this, watch this video. If you found value in this video, please leave a like and share the video with a friend. Consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already done so, and while you're at it, click on the notification bell to stay informed about inflation and many other interesting financial topics. Thanks for watching, hope to see you on the next one, but until then, stay invested.